Good afternoon, everybody, and a warm welcome. Before I begin, can I just run through some housekeeping with you this afternoon? Can I ask you put mute on in your machine or activate your mute button, please, right now? So we just have the speaker with mute on. If you have, as Lydia just put in the chat, any questions for our panelists during the session, please put it in the chat box and we'll pick them up as we go along. Also, Lydia put in about introducing yourself, so that's my housekeeping taken care of. So good afternoon from New York, or good morning, good afternoon and evening, wherever you might find yourself today. And for a moment, maybe we could take a moment to reflect on homelessness and displacement in Ukraine at this moment. And also to remember all our homeless sisters, our women and girls throughout the world at this time. My name is Jean Quinn, and I am part of the international community of the Daughters of Wisdom, the Executive Director of UNANIMA International, and co-chair of the working group to end homelessness. It's my privilege to welcome you here this afternoon for our parallel event during the Commission on the Status of Women, where the theme is achieving gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls in the context of climate change, environmental and disaster risk reduction, policies and programs. Today, the working group are looking at the priority theme through the lens of climate change, the increased risk for women and girls. The working group are continuing a journey which began for us in 2017, when a group of like-minded NGOs came together for advocacy on homelessness. Our Sustain Advocacy project resulted in having a priority theme addressing homelessness at the Commission of Social Development in 2020, which gave visibility to the global challenge of homelessness. At the conclusion of the Commission, the Economic and Social Council issued a resolution on homelessness, and for the first time in the history of the United Nations. So it was an amazing feat. We realized this was a non-binding resolution which lacked capacity to enforce implementation by member states. Hence the reason that the working group sought a binding resolution from the General Assembly. To achieve this, we as a group worked with member states to table a resolution at the third committee of the General Assembly. And the good news is that the resolution was passed by the General Assembly on December the 16th, 2021, which was very recently. And so here we are in the space of the Commission on the Status of Women 66, looking at homeless women and girls, focused on achieving gender equality and empowerment of all in the context of climate change, environmental and risk reduction policies and programs. The climate crisis gained ground alongside the pandemic, exacerbating suffering, especially in the most marginalized of communities. We know that gender justice and equality are inextricably linked to climate justice, economic justice, and social justice. Resource scarcity and climate emergency also intersect with sexual and gender-based violence in a way that engenders the full realization of human rights. There is a broad diversity of experiences when talking about homelessness, including neoliberal policies and the privatization of land and housing, the criminalization of homelessness and poverty, climate change, war, forced evictions, all of course exacerbated by COVID-19 pandemic, which profoundly impacts women and girls. So how do we define homelessness for women and girls? We need to widen our perspectives instead of looking at the issues of homelessness in women and girls, so that it centres homeless people's experience and knowledge as political and social advocates in our society, for they are the experts in their own experiences. Their voices are crucial for any public planning. We need the voices of women with a lived experience, or as I would say, their expertise of homelessness at the heart of any discussion and decisions regarding the climate crisis, women's land rights, and how natural resources and revenues from them are used. This event this afternoon aims to just do that, to share the lived experiences and have panelists explore the issue of climate-induced female homelessness from different areas of public planning. And these include housing as a human right and the right to a healthy planet, climate displacement, health for homeless people, and heightened risks for human trafficking. My machine went a little bit funny there, but thank you all as we begin, and we will, I'm really looking forward to this conversation with our panelists this afternoon. We have a great list of panelists to share the concerns we have around climate, homelessness as it relates to women and girls. And so we have our keynote speaker, which is the Special Rapporteur on Adequate Housing, Mr. Balakrishnan Rajapal. We are delighted to have you with us this afternoon to start off this conversation as the Special Rapporteur. You have the floor. You're on mute. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm honored and grateful to have been invited to provide the keynote for this discussion on the risks facing homeless women and girls in the context of climate change. This event captures three concerns of my mandate. First, homelessness as a fundamental violation of the right to adequate housing. Second, the impact of climate change. And third, discrimination in the enjoyment of the right to adequate housing. Homelessness has been a core concern of my mandate over many years, including that of my predecessor, Leilani Farha, who's also with us today. Last year, I published jointly with the Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty an op-ed on the issue of homelessness in the EU Observer. We also issued a call for input on the criminalization of homelessness. Currently, I'm analyzing together with my team the many responses received, which are also available on my website. In October last year and last week, I submitted two interrelated reports to the UN General Assembly and the Human Rights Council on housing discrimination and spatial segregation. Both reports underline that discrimination in housing is often interrelated and compounding and intersectional, affecting women and persons in situations of homelessness in accessing adequate housing and public services, and how spatial segregation contributes to undermine in a systemic way the enjoyment of the right to adequate housing. These reports followed my report to the UN General Assembly on COVID-19 and its impact on the right to housing, which also pointed to the color of COVID and the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on marginalized communities. Climate change is of similar concern to me. In fact, I have decided to dedicate my next thematic report to the Human Rights Council to examine the impact of climate change on the enjoyment of the right to adequate housing. Today's event and discussion will help advance my thinking for that report and to understand the gendered impacts of climate change. Climate change may be the most important global human rights crisis of our time, whose impacts are alarming already, but could unfortunately be worse than what we think. The long-term alteration of temperatures and weather patterns throughout the world is causing droughts, storms, floods, heat waves, melting glaciers, and warming oceans that destroy communities and severely changes the lives of those living in them. The multiple effects of climate change are leading to and are expected to further aggravate displacement and homelessness, particularly for vulnerable populations such as women and girls. Over 1 billion are under threat of being displaced by 2050 due to environmental changes, conflict, and civil unrest. Extreme events linked to climate change destroy homes, create displacement, and homelessness. According to the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, approximately 14 million people are being made homeless on average each year as a result of sudden disasters such as floods and storms. As climate change exacerbates the effects of weather events like flooding, hurricanes, and wildfires, it increases the likelihood of more displaced people who are facing housing insecurity and homelessness. Excuse me. Climate change also disproportionately affects persons already experiencing homelessness, especially women and girls. It should be noted that there are globally more persons living in situations of homelessness than many believe. Homelessness goes beyond its most visible form of street homelessness. It means not having stable, safe, and adequate housing and the lack of means and ability of obtaining it. Excuse me. In human rights law, homelessness must be understood comprehensively and therefore covers as well persons living in encampments, including internally displaced persons living in inadequate housing and persons living in informal settlements without security of tenure. Homelessness also includes what has been sometimes called as hidden homelessness, affecting millions of women who are involuntarily sheltering alone or with their children in the homes of friends, family members, or other persons, with increased potential for experiencing abuse in such contexts. I'm very happy to see currently renewed attention of the UN to the issue of homelessness, including by states of the Global South, as indicated by last year's UN General Assembly Resolution 177, which reflects such a comprehensive understanding of homelessness. To be clear, homelessness in itself is a fundamental violation of the right to adequate housing, which includes at its core the right of everyone to live in a place in peace, safety, and dignity. Persons experiencing homelessness are already among the most vulnerable in societies and are disproportionately impacted as they have few resources. While torrential floods, wildfires, and excessive heat and lack of shelter for protection may affect everyone in an affected area, persons who are either at risk of homelessness or who are already experiencing homelessness are much more likely to live in environmentally risky zones. As I have just outlined in my report on spatial segregation, presented last week to the Human Rights Council in Geneva, persons living in informal settlements, victims of displacement and forced evictions are much more likely to live in areas prone to landslides, flooding, and other natural disasters. In addition, persons experiencing homelessness have usually often more limited access to public safety nets, which are often themselves in jeopardy or at risk of fully disappearing when natural disasters occur. Although women and girls may experience street homelessness at a lower rate than men, the effects of climate change-induced disasters are profound. Women and girls do comprise the majority of hidden homelessness, living doubled up with family or friends. Alarming data from the UN Office for Disaster Reduction illustrates how women have suffered the most fatalities in several large disasters. 61% of deaths in Myanmar after Cyclone Nargis in 2008, over 70% of those killed in the wake of the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami in Banda Aceh, and a shocking 91% of those killed in Cyclone Gorky in Bangladesh in 1991. This higher mortality for women is especially due to poverty and increased vulnerability, and would certainly be exacerbated for women and girls in situations of homelessness who are displaced. In a recent report, UNDP has even indicated that women represent 80% of the people displaced by climate change. Climate change can exacerbate sexual and gender-based violence directed towards women. The already entrenched gender inequalities in every society greatly increase the risks of domestic violence, child marriage, and human trafficking for homeless and housing insecure women and girls. For example, women and LGBTQI+ people especially do not feel safe or welcome in shelters, which often do not have the infrastructure or capacity to house increasing number of climate refugees, such as separate bathroom facilities or sleeping areas. COVID-19 has only added to these vulnerabilities. Women are more likely to have lost their jobs than men during the COVID-19 pandemic, which increases the risk of falling into homelessness due to the decreased ability to pay rent or mortgages. The problems are further exacerbated by discrimination and inequality in housing. Women and girls are more likely to live in insecure, undignified, and unsafe conditions and are at increased risk of homelessness. Studies have shown that men and women have different abilities to adapt to climate change because of gender inequalities, which affect their capacity to access and control assets, services, and decision making. Women's ability to adapt to climate change is further limited by gender norms, roles, and biases present in communities, societies, places of work, and institutions, as one study in the Caribbean has demonstrated. In Haiti, after Hurricane Matthew struck in 2017, a household survey found that 67% of respondents were made homeless or forced to use temporary housing, and that women are significantly more likely than men to have reported ongoing displacement. A follow-up survey 4 months later found that 45.2% of male respondents reported living in permanent housing, while only 35.8% of female respondents reported living in an apartment or a house. Many women-headed households who have lost their homes may also have to stay in temporary housing and shelters longer, since their lack of land and housing titles means they may not be able to access disaster recovery housing support. Women's landlords may, for example, prioritize their own needs above rebuilding efforts for their tenants. Finally, women who have suffered from domestic violence in the past may have nowhere to go if the few shelters for women survivors of violence are destroyed in a natural disaster. Regrettably, little has been done to address the effects of climate change on women, let alone on women experiencing homelessness. This is particularly galling considering that women disproportionately lack land tenure, which is critical for action against climate change and is one of the pillars of the right to housing. At COP26, delegates discussed how worldwide fewer than 15% of landholders are women, a disparity which undermines the potential for climate action and meaningful progress towards the realization of the right to housing. Finally, looking at the domestic as well as international level, it is clear that women and girls have been afforded insufficient attention in climate change research and policymaking. The causal interrelationship between gender and climate change has not been sufficiently assessed due to inadequate or biased scientific tools and the inertia of climate change scientists who do not prioritize gender-based analysis. Back in 2016, the IPCC had already recognized that gender roles and relations shaped vulnerability and the overall capacity of people to adapt to climate change. Yet it was only in 2018 that it expressed the urgent need to, quote, address a pervasive lack of gender balance in climate change science, end of quote. A closer look at the representation of women in decision-making fora on climate change can also help explain this gap. Women participating in the UNFCCC negotiations are mostly part of non-governmental observers who are less influential than senior staff composed of representatives of government. Women make up only 32% of IPCC report writers on average. As for COP26, 75% of the delegates were made of men, while the UK hosting team was completely composed of men, with the exception of the climate chief. The voices of women and girls remain notably absent from the negotiations and decision-making spaces at COP26. And yet, examples from Switzerland and India tell us of adequate responses to climate change when women assume leadership positions to do actively participate in decision-making. Solutions to addressing the vulnerabilities of women and girls to climate change would vastly vary depending on the context and climate change threat experience. But in my view, they would invariably involve hearing the voices of women and girls and including them in decision-making and leadership roles. I look forward to learning of such solutions from the presentations of my fellow panelists and hopefully a great discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Rajapal. We're delighted you came. And just hearing about some of your concerns, obviously are the concerns of us in the working group to end homelessness around climate change, discrimination, and the right to housing. And I'm particularly pleased to hear about your thematic report that's going to come up for the Human Rights Council, and that whole area of climate change and the right to housing. And we, I suppose, as the experts now in the working group to End Homelessness, which worked on the last resolution, significant resolution at the General Assembly, would love to be involved in that conversation with you during the lead up to that presentation. And I couldn't agree more with you that part of the solution to the problems is hearing the issue of the experts, the people with the lived experience of homelessness in all its intersections, and that they take up a leadership role around the table. So thank you very much indeed for your presentation. And so next we go to Dr. Minnie Ojay. She's the immediate past national president of the Medical Women's Association of Nigeria. Ojay, you are going to address flood disasters in Delta State of Nigeria, the role of internally displaced persons and camps. You have the floor now. Are you there, Dr. Ojay? Dr. Ojay. Okay, well, maybe we will come back to Dr. Ojay if that's okay. Maybe if it's okay with you, Jennifer, Dr. Jennifer Guillaume, I'd like to come to you next, if that's okay. Jennifer is the Associate Professor of Clinical Health at St. John's University and pharmacist for Project Renewal in New York City. You're going to talk to us about health risks for homeless women due to climate exposure and extremes. Dr. Jennifer, you have the floor.
Great, thank you all. I'm just going to share my slides here. Thanks so much for the introduction. I'm really happy to be here and honored to be here among everyone. So, in this brief talk, I hope that you'll be able to understand the relationship between climate change, homelessness, and health, as well as identify some direct and indirect effects of climate change on homelessness and physical and mental health. And we'll have a special focus on cis and trans women and youth and non-binary people as well. And I hope also you'll be able to illustrate some ways to address the negative consequences of climate change on homelessness and health in vulnerable communities. So in addition to some of my work at St. John's at the College of Pharmacy there, I'm also a pharmacist at Project Renewal. It's a nonprofit organization based in New York City, and we provide social medical services for people experiencing homelessness. And so I'll be providing some context to some of the information in the slides today based on some of my work with my students at the site. But I think that what's central to understand, and which we just heard about, is really just this relationship between climate change, homelessness, and health. And as we know, climate change can directly and indirectly cause homelessness and poor health outcomes. In particular, for example, natural disasters can lead to homelessness through climate migration, and that can increase the risk of, for food insecurity, which can lead to poor health outcomes for patients by adversely impacting, their chronic disease management or making it difficult to prevent new ones from occurring. And this is really focusing on the health effects for people who are unhoused in terms of in the context of climate change. And frostbite, dehydration, and heat stroke in particular are some things that I do see in practice. We provide some mobile medical van work to patients, many of whom are unhoused but also unsheltered. And when we have these weather extremes, for example, in the summer months as we're approaching in New York City, some of those effects of climate change can directly impact the health of unhoused people by causing dehydration, for example, for folks who are unsheltered and also lack drinking water, this can be particularly concerning as they may have chronic health conditions, which they're taking medications for that can also, exacerbate that risk of dehydration. So this is usually top of mind for us as we approach the summer months. In addition, respiratory illness also comes into play. Air pollution can exacerbate chronic conditions such as asthma. And there was actually a recent study out of Harvard that found that, increased exposure to particulate 2.5, particulate matter 2.5 can actually increase the risk of COVID-19 mortality. So there's actually an associated relationship there that was found in that study. In addition, natural disasters can cause foodborne, waterborne, and vector-borne disease. Hepatitis A outbreaks have been occurring in our homeless communities across the US, and certainly climate change effects can further exacerbate the risk of those reoccurring. In addition, there are mental health related concerns. For example, people who have cognitive impairment or alcohol use disorder may have a higher risk of dying related to heat effects from climate change. Additionally, we have to consider those compounding factors, like I mentioned earlier. Even the lack of drinking water can, make it even harder to manage some of these risks associated with climate change, particularly for those people who are unsheltered at the moment. I'd like to also focus on LGBTQ plus youth, particularly around mental health. And there is a survey that was recently done by the Trevor Project that found that 20% of LGBTQ plus youth reported experiencing homelessness or housing instability. And homelessness and housing instability was actually reported at higher rates among trans and non-binary youth. In addition, LGBTQ plus youth experiencing homelessness are 2 to 4 times more likely to experience conditions such as depression or anxiety, self-harm, considering suicide, and attempting suicide compared to their counterparts with more stable housing. And so, although these are not direct effects of climate change on mental health of youth, and in particular LGBTQ plus youth, we need to recognize that further downstream, these effects of climate change can lead to homelessness, which can just further exacerbate these mental health conditions for patients. So this should be a top consideration for us as we think about ways to address those negative consequences associated with climate change. I'd also like to take a few moments to discuss the health of unhoused cis and trans women and non-binary people and some of their special considerations in care. In particular, we need to consider and recognize the various traumas that our patients bring with us when we see them in practice. Again, I practice in a primary care setting, often on a mobile medical van with a team of other medical professionals and students. And I think it's very important what we try to do at Project Renewals, provide trauma-informed care, being sensitive to, the experiences, the lived experiences, and several traumas like gender-based violence or intimate partner violence, which were discussed in the previous talk as well, and recognize, how we're approaching, patients and connecting them to various services, but also just in communicating with them in the exam room. Gender-based violence in particular, we're concerned about this, and this was mentioned before too, this, inadequacy in terms of having a lack of safe space for people, and gender-based violence can occur on the street and as well as in the shelter. And if patients don't feel safe in the shelters, and they're, forced to stay on the street. And this is something, again, we do see in practice often, and it's an ongoing issue that really needs to be addressed as we think about, again, how do we approach and address some of these larger issues that we see in patient care. There are also unique health needs that we need to meet for our patients, gender affirming care being one of them, including access to medications for gender affirming care, reproductive health needs, as well as cancer screening, period products, pregnancy, and postpartum care. At Project Renewal, we actually have a scan van, which is dedicated to free mammography screenings for patients in the New York City area who may not have access to a healthcare provider or have access to health insurance. And so this is a really important service that we're able to provide to patients. And just actually this morning, seeing a female patient on the van, had discussed screenings with her, and she mentioned that she couldn't remember the last time that she had a pap smear, and also said that she had never had a mammogram, and she had expressed some distrust with healthcare providers in the past. And she, and I offered information to her about the types of services that we offer at Project Renewal, and she was, agreeable to be seen by one of our providers, and she said, I trust you, and I'll be, I'd be willing to see someone as long as they're one of the providers at this site. And that, I think, just goes to show how important it is, the work that we're doing, but also the need to kind of really think about healthcare delivery in a different way, and making sure that we're providing care to groups who are disproportionately impacted by homelessness, but also have these unique health needs that aren't necessarily routinely offered to patients, and making that just very accessible to people who may not have health insurance and may not have routine primary care. And I think also just thinking about those compounding factors makes it even more difficult for patients to access those screenings and those special unique healthcare needs, like I mentioned before. And last, I just wanted to touch base on the socio-ecological model, and thinking about this model as we think about ways to address those negative consequences of climate change on health and homelessness. And this is something that I speak to my students about, often thinking kind of beyond, as a student pharmacist, what we can do in terms of medication management is really important on the individual and interpersonal levels, doing that education that we're providing, dispensing medications to patients. But beyond that, we do provide shelter-based work and work at soup kitchens, kind of really thinking about those fixtures within the community where we can provide services and outreach to patients to connect them to the resources that they need. And then, also just kind of recognizing on a societal level that housing is a fundamental human right. And we need to think about, again, those kind of structural reasons why we're seeing these gaps in care for patients and why it's hard for them to meet their therapeutic treatment goals. And so I hope that, this is something we can kind of keep in mind as well as we kind of move forward in this conversation. And I thank you again for your time.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Be happy to take questions in the chat. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Just in relation, before I say anything to there will be hopefully at the end time for question and answers. And also thank you for putting up the bios in the chat box. They're too long for us to, we want to give time for the speakers, not necessarily for the bios. So, but you have all the details in the chat box. Thank you very much for that perspective, Jennifer, in relation to that socio-medical support and that rounded approach, I suppose, to how we're dealing with homelessness as it relates to climate, women and girls. And you're talking about it too from the perspective here in New York, which you talked about. It was interesting to note the consequences for the unhoused, and I'm thinking of, you talked about the frostbite to the heat stroke, both ends of the scale, which are important for us to keep in our mind. This is near enough to where we are all living, if you like, and how we respond to illnesses associated with homelessness. And you name particularly the LGBTQ youth and the Trevor Project, and I know you gave us details of that in your presentation, and will be we'll obviously share this with people that are come to the panel this afternoon, because I think it's really important to look at that housing instability in relation to the LGBTQ youth. And also, I suppose, the special consideration, which I think you're right for us to look at, and even listening to the special rapporteur on the health of the unhoused trans women and non-binary people. And maybe we need to be highlighting some of that. I was particularly impressed. It's a dream to me to hear somebody talking about trauma and homelessness, and we worked really hard to get that word into the resolution. Well, we didn't manage to get that, but we got the psychosocial report, the support, which you actually went on to talk about, that whole social ecological model, policies which promote prevention, if you like, of homelessness and street homelessness. So thank you very much. That was really a really important presentation for us here with the Working Group to End Homelessness. And I'm sure we'll be back to you with some questions, Jennifer. Thank you very much. I don't know whether Dr. Minnie is back. Is she, Tiffany or Lydia? She is, Teresa. Okay, can I go back to you,
yes.
Minnie? Can you hear me?
Miss, yes, I can hear you, and I'm speaking.
Okay,
I'm having
great.
network challenges. So if I kind of get interrupted, could they just keep scrolling the slides until they finish? Because my network keeps fluctuating.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
I just want to welcome you very much indeed, Dr. Minnie Ojay. You're the immediate past national president of the Medical Women's Association of Nigeria. And you're going to address us within that context, addressing flood disasters in Delta State of Nigeria, the role of internally displaced persons and camps. So you now have the floor.
Thank you. Please, I will turn off my video so that the network can let me present.
Excellent.
So I'm talking about addressing flood disaster in Delta State of Nigeria, the role of IDP camps, that's internally displaced camps, and looking at the priority theme for CSW66, as well as our parallel session, climate change, multiple risks for homeless women and girls. We'll go on to the definitions. Disaster is any occurrence that causes damage, economic disruption, loss of human life, and deterioration in health and health service on a scale sufficient to warrant an extraordinary response from outside the affected community or area. While an internally displaced person is someone who is forced to leave their home, but who remains within their country's borders. They could have been rendered homeless by natural disasters such as flooding or man-made disasters such as insurgency. They're often accommodated.
Excuse me, Dr. Ojay, can I ask Tiffany, are you doing these slides? We're not seeing the slides.
Just keep rolling them because
yeah, give me 1 second.
Yes.
Thank you.
So these IDPs are often accommodated in temporary locations known as IDP camps and require a range of health and social services, including reproductive health services. The major disasters in Africa include famine, floods, and droughts, and the various effects of disaster in health range from mortality and injuries to food shortages, as well as endemic diseases.
I'm sorry, Dr. Ojay, I apologize for coming in again. We're not seeing the slides.
1 second, I'm trying to share them.
I don't have control over the slides. And I'm so scared that my network will not allow me to finish the presentation. So can they fix the slides while I keep talking?
Okay, thank you.
So flood is one of the natural disasters that affect several parts of the world, including Nigeria. The effects can be exacerbated by man-made situations such as release of water from dams, dumping of waste, and erection of structures that block the free flow of drainage channels. Appropriate management of flood disaster should be done according to the 5 phases of disaster. We have the non-disaster or the inter-disaster phase, the pre-disaster phase, the impact phase, the emergency phase, as well as the reconstructional rehabilitation phase. And there is need for regular updates on the flood disaster, such as number of houses submerged, number of relief camps established, number of people registered in the camps, as well as number of voluntary organizations rendering assistance. Now, Delta State has experienced flood in 2012, 2018, 2019, and 2020. And in each of these years, except 2020, there were internally displaced camps to keep these people that were displaced by the flood. But in 2020, because of the COVID pandemic, there were no internally displaced camps. So we had several activities to control the flood disaster: provision of food, water, and sanitary facilities, provision of information, mobilizing disease surveillance notification officers, mobilization of public health and environmental health teams to create awareness of various measures needed to prevent disease, vaccination of children in the camps, provision of skill acquisition in the IDP camps and starter packs for those who graduated, installmental compensation of registered victims of flood disaster, giving them cash, foodstuff. Now, one of the concerns of the medical doctors in Delta State about the flood disaster was if the reproductive health needs of those in the relief camps were being taken care of, e.g., making condoms available for use for the IDP camp residents. There was also the technical committee, and if you go to the pictures, you will see a photograph from a newspaper of the former governor of Delta State, Dr. Dwanga, is paddling a canoe and moving towards one of the flood-prone disaster areas. And then we also have the mobile field hospital in one of the camps with health services being rendered by the health workers. We also have other camps like the camp in Osisa, and you see the lodgings of the people who were displaced, where they had to stay in schools and use mattresses to keep on the floor where they slept. You can scroll through to the pictures. Now, all through this period, we had to do a lot of monitoring to ensure that all the services that we required, such as antenatal, family planning, immunization, they were all provided in these camps, because the other facilities where they should have received them, many of them were submerged by the flood. Fortunately for us, we had in 2019, the Reproductive Health Technical Working Group for the UNFPA flood response in Delta State. Their terms of reference included to advocate to government support for the state reproductive health program, ensuring favorable policies and environment, support the coordination of reproductive health units and other stakeholders' monthly meetings, support the promotion of an integrated approach in implementing the reproductive health activities with other health programs in emergency situations, as well as implementation, monitoring, and evaluation of the UNFPA medical outreaches. Then I'm going to talk about a bit about Hurricane Sandy that occurred in 2012, the same time as the major flood, the first major flood disaster occurred in Delta State. And we had some comparison. There were highlights to show that Sandy showed hospitals were unprepared when the disaster hit home. Hurricane Sandy destroyed years of medical research. Young brothers were denied refuge and swept to death by Sandy. And there are pictures of the hovercraft to rescue, Red Cross evacuation shelter, a home that was destroyed by Superstorm Sandy, and the cleaning crews working. And we could see that there was a huge difference between the way the United States managed their own flood disaster and the way we were managing ours. However, we came out with a personal and household emergency plan for anyone who is likely to be warned of having a disaster. Decide where you need to go if you need to leave. What will you take with you if you are to shelter in a place? Food, water, drugs, cash, ATM cards or checkbook, mobile phones, chargers, immunization records, personal identification documents such as international passports, ID cards, driver's license. Fill up your car with fuel before a storm and keep a minimum of half tank in the car all the time. Get to know your neighbors too. The most valuable items may be your certificate, so you may wish to scan the originals and email them to yourself to have a copy in cyberspace. Now, achieving gender equality in the context of climate change today for a sustainable tomorrow, we are happy to say that the women in Delta State of Nigeria are at the forefront of addressing climate change. I'm the permanent secretary of the Delta State Ministry of Environment, and since I became permanent secretary in that ministry, we have had partnership with several recycling companies, and more women and women-led NGOs have shown interest in recycling plastic bottles, as well as sensitizing the public on the activity. On the 18th of March 2022, Delta State Ministry of Environment partnered with Working Fingers International Initiative, a women-led organization, to organize a tree planting exercise in the Nelson Mandela Garden of 95 trees. These are some of the pictures. The Delta State President of the Medical Women's Association of Nigeria, Dr. Abe, is one of our waste recycling advocates. There she is, recycling bottles. And myself and Ms. Margaret Obiko, we've been sensitizing church members on proper waste disposal as well as recycling. What are our future plans? Identify and promote alternatives to activities producing high level of carbon emissions, sensitization of various establishments on measuring carbon footprint and performing greenhouse gas emission inventory, erection of billboards on climate change, commission of research on studies on climate change and improving air quality, rechanneling of flared gases into power generation, establishment of biogas plants, and production of briquettes from agricultural waste and sawdust for cleaner energy. Conclusion, the climate change crisis can be tackled in our environment if we all chip in our little bit. It is not too late to start. Thank you.
My goodness, you did very well, Dr. Ojay, considering all the technical problems we had. And for all our guests who are with us today, we will get your PowerPoint to them, because one of the things that struck me about your presentation was, you know, the practical solutions you had, the planning you've gone into when there's flood disaster, what needs to happen. The external response and the internal response, you know, all that area of food and sanitary facilities, and the setting up of the committee to manage flood relief funds, which was very practical and needed. And the whole area of reproductive health technical working group, which was very practical. And then taking us through Hurricane Sandy and the difference in how the things were planned. I think that was really interesting. And again, like all of us, as you said, you are at the forefront of addressing climate change in Nigeria, as women in Nigeria, and we're very pleased about that. In terms of your future plans, it went very quickly, but what struck me was the commission, to have a commission research on climate change, which I think that would be a very important piece of research. Thank you very much indeed for being with us today. That was a very good presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I had to rush through. Bye.
That's all right. Thank you very much. And so now we move on to Sister Aisha Katu, a missionary sister and community developer in Nepal. Sister Aisha, you're going to talk to us about safe places and housing for women and girls during natural disasters, particularly in preventing trafficking. You're most welcome, and you now have the floor.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here this afternoon. As you said, my topic is multiple risks for homeless women and girls in climate change. It does not matter what kind of crisis or a disaster people come across, whether natural or human-made, women and children suffer the most of its impacts. Women and girls are also the victims of every conflict situations. Often it is said that women are weak and vulnerable, yet it is women who rise up to take responsibility for the well-being of their families and communities during a crisis and prove they are strong. I say this because on my own experience, on April 25th, 2015, I was at an ordination ceremony in a mountain village in Nepal with another SCN when the massive earthquake took place around noon. I felt the earthquake shaking and saw huge trees falling down, big mountains crashing down the houses, and it destroyed. We were covered with a plume of thick dust. A few feet away from where we stood, the ground split and chasm appeared. We also helplessly witnessed people and animals dying from the falling trees and shattered buildings. To my amazement, I saw the men running out of the houses for safety as soon as they sensed the impending danger. But it was women who looked around to grab their children before they ran out. Some of these women and children died and were injured seriously as the house collapsed on them while getting out. The men escaped without any injury or loss of life. It was a heartbreaking experience for me. I can never forget these scenes. The earthquake and landslide damaged every road, making the return journey on our center in Kathmandu a difficult one. We were able to get out only after 3 days, that too on foot and by jeeps in between. Back at home, We were concerned about the people in a mountain village called Koshidekha, 70 kilometers away, where we had begun community organizing a skills training program for women. Since communications were cut off, the only way to reach out to them was making a trip to see how they were impacted. Since the roads were not motorable, we hired 2 motorbikes and set out on another arduous journey. What awaited us in the village were heart-wrenching scenes. The traumatized villagers welcomed us with tears. We were the first group who had come to check on them 5 days after the earthquake. All their houses, 507 of them, had collapsed, destroying everything. They had nothing to eat, no place to sleep, and protection from the cold at night. Continuous rain, cold, and aftershock made life unbearable. After visiting these people, I decided to stay with them in the village to support and assess their immediate needs. Tents served as temporary shelter for sleeping at night, and I too joined them in the tent. At 2 a.m. at night, we were all wakened with a loud cry. Fearing another quake, everyone ran out, excuse me, only to realize that a leopard from a nearby jungle had dragged a woman from another tent. Though people ran after the leopard, they could not save the woman. It was a harrowing experience for all. Again, the victim is a woman. We purchased groceries, food, clothes, blankets, and other necessaries to meet their immediate needs. Women with special needs received extra care. A couple of medical camps we conducted. During the first week, we noticed 2 men coming to the village, assuring the people with help. They approached some women and girls with the promises of jobs to support their families if they accompanied them. Realizing that these men were human traffickers, we held awareness sessions for the women, girls on trafficking, and the tactics middlemen use to lure them away. Our team put up a small tent to stay with the village people in the village, to assess the situation and make plans for reconstruction and rehabilitation. Right from the beginning, we created child-friendly space for children so that women would be freed for another activities. With assistance from a nearby school principal, young girls and boys were trained to teach little ones. Children were provided with food, toys, books, and games. Mothers were relieved that young girls were engaged in activities and not allowed to wander around and be trafficked. We also had a safe space for women to gather. Women were provided with counseling sessions and psychosocial support to reduce their trauma. Gradually, they were engaged in small-scale training, like tailoring, embroidery, knitting, mushroom cultivation, etc. They helped to occupy women in a meaningful way. As the days went by, villagers were organized in women's group and farmers group, and were provided with better seeds and seedlings to vegetable cultivation, fruit trees and greenhouses for off-season cultivation to generate additional income for self-sufficiency. In the midst of these activities, we accompanied the women very closely to ensure that they were not trafficked or were not lured into migrate. Gradually, we helped them to move from common tents to temporary house built with the tin sheets and tarpaulins we supplied. Returning to their own family units were immense joy to the people. During these struggles time, a value that the villagers lived by and noticeable was their sense of community, that we are all together in this. Though they belong to different castes, economic, they lived under the same roof, cooking, eating same meals, and helping one another to recover. They lived what it means to be in solidarity. The next move was construction of permanent houses. To provide raw materials, mainly bricks, we set up a cement brick making technical support and all material. The villagers, especially women, took a keen interest and worked daily wages and earned money to support their family. To collect drinking water, we gave each family a water tank. Though construction of their 2-room house took time, they had to build a toilet in the first phase. Our organization helped to build 484 houses. The local government was always a part of our planning, and they provided support all through the reconstruction phase. Other activities helped to bring sense normality was to get the children back to school. Reconstruction of a school building which was destroyed in quake was one of the first activities that initiated. We built a multipurpose community hall. It was a center for activity for all. Along with this, counseling was made available to the villagers. It helped them to deal with their own trauma. Another challenge was that people wanted to solve their drinking water crisis. The earthquake had dried up their water sources. Women had to walk miles in the hills to collect water. Koshideka, situated at the top of mountain, had a clear view of Koshi River, fed by mountain glaciers flowing down in the valley. Even when rain fails, Koshi did not fail to flow. The only way to bring water from the river to village was through lifting water through different pumping stations from the water tanks at different elevations.
Can I ask you to come to an end, Aisha?
Yeah. It took 4 years to finish the work. The cost of the water project was 80 million Nepali rupees. 60% of this was raised by our congregation and 40% by the government. It was a dream coming true for our people of Koshideka. Now they are able to have a small kitchen garden and raise animals and cows. For the past 6 years, we accompanied the people for a resilient rebuilding their lives, training and giving them different trainings. Formation of children's club and climate change groups in local schools have helped to raise awareness and take climate action. Sustainable development and systemic change principles were employed in all the interventions as we accompanied our people for 6 years. Our partnership with the people has resulted sustainable development and change in attitude towards gender equality and respect for women. There is peace and harmony in the village at present. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aisha. I mean, you said at the beginning that women in crisis prove they are strong. Well, I think you're one of these people, as you told that, that your life experience of the landslide and the earthquake and what you witnessed. I'm visual, so in my mind, I could just see you and the splitting of the earth there in front of you and people dying and the women running to help. And as you described, the men running for their own safety, which was an interesting highlight to hear from you today. And then I suppose, you know, looking at you getting the motorbikes to go to traumatized villagers and then the practical support you kept offering. It was a very moving presentation of a lived experience. And we're very, very grateful that you are here with us today. Thank you so much. And so now it's on to Dana Marlowe and Diamond Cotton from the I Support Girls Experience of Homelessness and the project Restoring Dignity to Hundreds of Women and the very practical side of the support that you offer to women. Dana and Diamond, you're both most welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here today. And I certainly appreciate Tiffany and Lydia for queuing up the deck. We have just a short slides that I'll share through. But first, I'd like to just give you a quick overview of who our NGO I Support the Girls is and what we do. We are an international nonprofit featuring a network of 59 global affiliates like chapters who collect and distribute really essential items, including bras, underwear, menstrual hygiene products, toiletries, and more, which really allow women and folks experiencing homelessness, impoverishment, or distress to stand tall with dignity. And in the 6 years that our NGO has been around, we've donated over 17 million products, and you can see the breakdown on the screen, to over 3,700 social service organizations. And that's homeless shelters, refugee agencies, domestic violence organizations, LGBTQ organizations, and so on. We do have on the next slide a variety of programs from our flagship affiliate network to our Forces for Change program, our ASH Kit, which came out of the COVID pandemic to provide some direct service to folks in need, and specifically our disaster relief initiative, which is going to be the focus of what we share about today. So really, I'm here to talk about a little bit about the impact of climate change, obviously, on women and girls as it relates to I Support the Girls' focus on them, but specifically two categories of folks: menstruators, or people with periods. And as Dr. Jennifer mentioned earlier on during this presentation, during this webinar, it's always important to point out that not all women have periods, and not all people that have periods are women. But for the purposes of this, you'll hear me kind of code switch between women and girls, menstruators, people with periods, because we are talking about a large swath of individuals. So these two categories, these menstruators, those displaced by natural disasters, and also those experiencing homelessness due to poverty. So I Support the Girls believes that menstrual products should be readily available with minimal barriers to access to folks that are displaced or homeless. So globally, when we respond to disasters, we prioritize nimbleness and speed in order to meet immediate needs. So we've heard time and time again, no one is thinking to pack, really basic needs, pads, tampons, liners, like I'm holding up here, when one is fleeing a hurricane, a wildfire, tornadoes, or tsunamis. And the need really often needs to start even before the disaster strikes. So existing international disaster relief protocols don't really focus or include menstrual health, and omission that results in displaced persons managing their periods in unsanitary and oftentimes inconsistent ways. And so really expecting a traumatized, overwhelmed person who's had to flee everything that's familiar to them because of a global disaster really can be dehumanizing and unrealistic when they have to then go and manage their period on top of everything else. So also, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the global stigma that exists around talking about periods. And with the average age of menstruation happening at 12 years old, the number of people needing pads or tampons while displaced is rising. In addition to dealing with sanitation issues, lack of access to menstrual products, lack of privacy, and cultural beliefs and stigmas around menstruation, displaced persons may experience disruptions as well in their menstrual cycle. So having access to these products is really essential. One thing that we regularly point out is that during any natural disaster, you can see on the screen, whether it's in Haiti or Puerto Rico or in Jordan, where we've stepped in and helped out to try and provide these items around dignity. Or most recently in the lower right corner, you'll see I Support the Girls has been packing products day and night to get over to Ukraine, Poland, and Slovakia right now to help refugees and folks in need. 25% of women and girls are going to experience their period during these natural disasters. And the dangers and challenges of displacement due to disaster are very similar to those experiencing homelessness or intense poverty. So it's very challenging to have access to shelter or insurance or even proof of address to access government resources during these times. So, I mean, just for so many folks we've talked about, imagine your home has been wrecked by a natural disaster due to climate change, and there's a hurricane that's come through. Your home has been just destroyed. You've fled. You're living in some kind of makeshift shelter, wherever that might be. It could be in some huge community center, and then you have your period, or your daughter has her period, with no access to supplies for 5 days or 6 days. And here I live in the Washington, D.C. area of the United States, where we're headquartered, and menstrual health management is not a part of disaster protocol, nor programs to address, nor is it in programs to address poverty as far as menstrual health management included in other programs. Our programs here in the US, SNAP, WIC, and other programs that do support low-income families don't necessarily cover, these basic items like pads or tampons. And they're also taxed as luxury items in 27 US states. So it really is my honor on the next slide to introduce to you my friend Diamond Cotton today. And she and I are going to have a little conversation. Diamond is a mom like me, and she's also an environmental service worker. And really, in the last few years, we have seen Diamond shine as an advocate for women's health. And this is no small feat, because as you're going to hear from Diamond, she's also has lived experience with homelessness through the years. And as far as period poverty, and we're going to hear from her challenges of navigating support for her children. So Diamond is going to share some firsthand perspective to our conversation about what it's like to experience period poverty. So thank you so much for joining us, Diamond. And if you could start with a little background to share before we jump in, please.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me, Dana. I have 3 children, 1 teenage daughter, 1 preteen daughter, and a 4-year-old son. I have experienced homelessness when my daughters were young, involving me to house hop. I was more stable until the pandemic hit. The pandemic hit caused me to lose my job. The grocery store shelves were empty, and it made it very hard for me to get childcare. My oldest child started her menstrual, and there were no resources for me. No government support. Government support does not include period products at all. So I sought out help, and I discovered I support the girls here in Indianapolis.
Thank you so much for sharing a little bit, Diamond, of your journey with us. I would love to just kind of dive a little bit deeper into what it meant for you to not have access to menstrual products at various times over the last decade. Can you share a little bit about what that was like for you or your family?
Yes. When my daughters were young, I had to choose between household needs or my menstrual products. And that within itself is really hard, because as a mother, you want to make sure that you have the needs for your children, like a house, make sure you have food on the table, running water, but also when your menstrual comes, that's also a health crisis for you that you need to take care of as well. So it was very hard for me and put me in a situation. When the pandemic hit, I had to choose between working at the hospital and getting sick, or staying home and not having income to support my children. During this time, it wasn't just me that was needing pads, it was my daughters too. It hurt very well that I could not provide as much as I could. It put me in a predicament to choose over my daughter's health or pay my rent. So I chose her health, of course. It did eventually put me back on the right path, my son's health has complications, so I stayed home with the children during a lot of the pandemic, and their needs came first. The times were very hard.
Yeah, no, it sounds really, really challenging, Diamond. And those are some decisions that are incredibly challenging to have to make. And I am happy that your kids are receiving the services that they need. Most importantly, that is paramount. And I know that you and I have had multiple conversations over the last couple of years. And you have some other really pearls of wisdom and other gems as far as what you've shared with me and our colleagues about other folks who are experiencing period poverty and what that's like and lived experience with homelessness. And I just would like to give you the floor to share a little bit more about that with folks.
For women and girls experience homelessness and period poverty, I want them to know that they are not alone. And that I've, of course, have to experience being homeless. And I've laid on couches, floors, had a bag for food when I didn't have it, when I was not wanted in a place. I experienced not having enough period products to get by, to even go to work or even school myself. That put me in a situation to choose between other important needs. I do not agree that we should pay for period products, menstrual products. We deserve as women and girls that we should have these items free to us and not taxed, like all other hygiene items and toilet paper. The point of me saying this is that to let women and girls to know that we are not alone, that they are not alone, and that there are resources available.
I hate, Donna, to bring it to a close, but you might just close up. We still have one speaker left, if that's okay.
Sure. No, I just want to personally thank you, Diamond. I know it's truly my pleasure to be listening to you and have you share your story with everybody, because we understand that the experience for folks who are experiencing homelessness due to climate change or other reasons is happening globally, worldwide, and this really has exacerbated period poverty. And so climate change may not be top of mind when folks think about menstrual equity and period poverty and homelessness, but it should be. So thank you so much, Diamond. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Diamond, and again for your advocacy in relation to women's health. And thank you actually for sharing your experience, Diamond, which is not always easy, but you are the expert, and we're hearing what you're saying, and you know what is needed, what are the solutions, and the solutions around health, really, as you said, you know, you have to choose. Is it between your health or, you know, your family, the needs of your family, the household, the groceries, all of that kind of thing. And that shouldn't happen. So you've given us one practical solution to the issues of the crisis. Thank you also, Donna, for your presentation as well, and helping us to understand the whole practicality of menstruators at this time, and particularly with people on the move that we're seeing all the time now. As you said, 25% will experience periods during this time, and the difficulties in accessing what they need, and particularly if you're in a traumatized situation. So thank you for highlighting that during this session today. Thank you both very much. Lastly, but not least, it's my great pleasure to introduce Leilani Farah, the Global Director of The Shift and the Executive Director of the NGO Canada Without Poverty, and former UN Special Rapporteur on adequate housing, and a great friend, I would say, to the working group to end homelessness. When we think of you, Leilani, we think warmly, and we think of the amount of time you gave us leading up to the first resolution. But now you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Jean, and it is such a pleasure to be here. I'm grateful to the working group to have included me. I'm grateful to Diamond in particular for having shared her experiences and really drawing out for us the dignity interests at stake here. I wanted to begin just by reflecting on an experience I had many moons ago at the kind of the beginnings of my work in the area of housing and homelessness and human rights. I had occasion to visit New Orleans after Katrina, the big hurricane that really decimated populations there, particularly African-American populations. And I met an older woman who's disabled, an older woman living in homelessness. And I asked her how she felt living in the richest country in the world in the conditions in which she found herself. And she looked at me and she said one word. She said, abandoned. That stayed with me. And then when I became rapporteur in 2014 and I started traveling the world and meeting with women and others living in homelessness in every region, echoes of Naomi from New Orleans. Women kept saying to me, I just want to be treated like a human being. I want to be seen. We aren't seen. Climate change only exacerbates these feelings and experiences. For example, I visited places where climate mitigation was being undertaken by governments. So climate mitigation strategies, rendering invisible homeless people living where those mitigation strategies were taking place, ignoring the fact that an informal settlement was established where the mitigation strategy was taking place. Similarly, the failure of states to adequately address climate change suggests a lack of concern for those who are on the front lines of it. And we've heard plenty of examples and experiences of women and girls and trans people who are in the face of the climate crisis. And so when states don't do what's necessary to address it, they're ignoring that population, rendering them invisible. The feeling that a woman's humanity isn't recognized, that her membership in the human family is questioned, is what makes homelessness a fundamental human rights issue. It's the fact that homelessness jeopardizes life itself and undermines human dignity that makes homelessness a human rights issue. I mean, after all, what are human rights about in their essence? Recognizing that we are all part of the human family, deserving of dignity and respect. I have met with many governments over the years to talk about homelessness and other housing related issues. And I'll be honest to say, I have never met a government that didn't care about homelessness. I never met a government at any level, national, regional, city level, municipal level. I never met a government official who was proud of homelessness within their borders. So it's not that they don't care, but it's perhaps that they don't care enough. And I think the General Assembly resolution that the working group has managed to get through is hugely important in this regard, because it demands of governments that they care and that they care enough. Now, with all that's going on in the world right now, I do wonder if governments have lost sight of their human rights obligations and their obligations with respect to the Sustainable Development Goals, which clearly articulate that all states must end homelessness by 2030. Because Target 11.1 of the SDG says that states must move to ensure access to adequate, affordable, secure housing for all by 2030. If that doesn't mean ending homelessness, what does it mean? Of course, the pandemic was in fact the moment when Herculean efforts should have been made to end homelessness. It didn't prove to be. So how do we get governments to understand the urgency for women and girls and trans of the conflation of the climate crisis and the homelessness crisis? The death sentence this represents for women and girls around the world. Well, we keep doing this. We keep talking and raising our voices and making demands of governments to meet their legal human rights obligations and commitments. I think we need to remind states that they need to pivot. They need to recognize people living in homelessness are rights holders. They're not just beneficiaries of charity. And as rights holders, they are entitled to adequate, affordable, secure housing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leilani, for that always on the button, as they say in Ireland, and reflecting on your experience and the meeting of the woman after Katrina. And the word she used was abandonment. And I suppose I've been 30 odd years working in the whole area of homelessness. And it's a word I would hear all of the time. And I suppose I'm saying to myself, when are we going to stop hearing that word where people feel abandoned? And I want to be seen. I picked up a woman years and years ago off the street in Dublin, and she was making that point to me as I picked her up. She said, I want to be seen. Well, I didn't particularly want to be seen, but she, through me, had to be seen, if you like. And I think that exacerbates situation for people who have that experience, if you like. And I think you also talked about how it undermines their human rights and their human right to adequate housing. There's no getting away from it. 11.1 in the SDGs is very clear. Our time to achieve this has got shorter, as you just said. We're into 8 years, are we now at this stage, and where they must end homelessness. The new resolution, we are putting so many things in front of member states, governments and member states, to help them in this project to eliminate homelessness. This final resolution that was passed in December 2021, they have to come back by 2023 and report on homelessness. So we're hoping that these steps will bring us nearer and nearer to some kind of solutions to what we're talking about. So as always, thank you so much, Leilani. I think we do have some time for questions and answers. If people would like to put their hand up, maybe somebody can pick it up. Or Marianne, if you have a question there for a panel, please.
I have not seen any questions, Jean, but I'm wondering, but I believe Tiffany might be scanning closer than I am, but I would like to welcome people who are here today to join the work of the working group to end homelessness. And I'm going to suggest, and I will put into the chat box our website, and perhaps they can get in touch with us to say they'd like to join our work and to be a part of this group. We need everyone if this is going to change in the next few years. We need everyone to be working towards recognizing homeless people as rights holders, and we need everyone to accompany us in this work. The member states need to be held accountable, and services need to be developed. It is right now civil society who's providing these services. I think that Diamond made a very good point when she said this should be a part of healthcare, and we really need to look at that.
Thank you. I think I see Dana's hand up. Thank you, Marianne. Dana, I don't want to run out of time and not be able to acknowledge your hand.
I just wanted to reply to Shannon Webster's question in the chat from earlier, that asked, are reusable period products like cups and period underwear preferred? And the question went on. But I'll say, as an organization, we donate tens of thousands of reusable products like period underwear or menstrual cups or reusable pads. It does have to be, the recipient has to want them. There's a request, and some of them have a longer learning cycle. So we like to make sure that they're getting the education and they have the time and space to learn, like the menstrual cup is not always intuitive, for example. So we as an organization also partner with other NGOs, and we donate tens of thousands to recipients who want them. It really just depends. Thank you.
I suppose it's one of, there's no other hand coming up that I can see, but I think it strikes me as we have these conversations, we're going deeper into the issues of homelessness. And sometimes we need to go away and reflect on the issues. And as Marianne just gave all the details of the working group to end homelessness, we are available for any questions and responses that you may look for from us as we merge into the future. And we have other ideas of where we want to bring the working group to end homelessness, particularly with our member states. One of the things that strikes me, that as we're coming to the end, that having listened to everybody and the contributions, is that we are all co-producers of our social realities, as we have heard today, as it relates to leadership and homelessness. And we've heard that it's not static. It's a sort of an ever-changing or flux interconnectedness. That's what struck me, that seeks sort of to create an emergence of a better future for women and girls who find themselves homeless, and as we would say, who are at the furthest end of homelessness. We have to find solutions, but we do so as we collaborate together and create a synergic system of innovative solutions. And just listening to our speakers and those who are on the webinars who've been putting in comments, we have to understand that we all have a role to play in the creation of a better world with our individual skills and creativity, and especially in ending homelessness for women and girls. In relation to the leadership style of the working group to end homelessness, we actually define our success around more systemic and inclusive notion of success that takes into account the economy, society, ecosystems, and future generations to break the cycle of homelessness. So whilst we celebrate our achievement in relation to the resolution, it's only the beginning of our journey. And today's conversation with our expert panel helped us to delve deeper into the intersectionality of homelessness. And so we're very grateful that all of you were able to respond to our invitation to be with us today. Of course, I would like to thank the background team, especially Jackie, Marianne, Teresa, Pat, Tiffany, and Lydia. We put a lot of work into these sessions because we're all passionate about the whole issue of homelessness, and that all of you were able to join us here today. So on behalf of everybody, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jean, for your moderation.
Thank you very much, Leilani.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Thanks, everyone. It was wonderful to hear from everybody today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Isha.
Well, thank you, Sister Aisha. That was a fascinating story.
Thank you.